Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we're talking about what we learned about relationships at the Wisdom 2.0 conference. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan and Lee Burgess. That's me. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. Alison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started.
Welcome back. Today, we're talking about some of the things we learned about relationships at the Wisdom 2.0 conference, which we attended in March. We will actually have a few upcoming podcast episodes keying off of what we learned this weekend, which was great. And if you're curious about the Wisdom 2.0 conferences, we'll link to them in the show notes. So the first talk we attended was a panel with Dr. John Gottman, Dr. Julie Schwartz Gottman, Rachel Abrams, who is a doctor, and her husband, Doug Abrams. And they've written a book together called 8 Dates, which we haven't read, but it sounds really interesting. Lee's going to read it on Amazon soon.
It's coming. It was delayed.
Yeah, because everybody bought them.
Everybody bought them. So it's. I'm hoping it's at my postal box right now.
Yeah, so the talk was really interesting. And you may have heard about them. If you've ever done therapy, you've probably heard about the Gottmans if you're talking about your relationships. And I guess Malcolm Gladwell talked a little bit about it in Blink. So Lee, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that was the first time I'd ever heard of the Gottmans. Gladwell talked about John Gottman specifically, and his, I guess really the cornerstone of what he has done in his research is he's a mathematician, so he's created these models that can be applied to psychology research, which is pretty interesting. And he can actually predict whether or not a couple will be successful with amazing accuracy after watching them interact on a video. And I think they have to be discussing conflict. And the accuracy is like 90%.
Yeah, it's really crazy.
It's really crazy. And they have something called the Gottman Institute. Their website is really fascinating, and something even called, I think it's called the Marriage Minute. They send out this little blurb each week about tips about relationships. I got one today.
Nice.
It was on how important hand-holding is and the touch of somebody that you care about, like holding your hand can like lower your stress hormones.
I think I read this.
Yeah, so they did this MRI test, and they had somebody holding a stranger's hand and somebody holding somebody that cares about hand, and your brain waves change depending on who you're touching. But anyway, fascinating stuff. So if you want their Marriage Minute, you can sign up for that for free on their website.
Nice.
But anyway, back to what Gottman does when he looks at couples. When he's evaluating couples, he does this by looking at negative communication patterns that predict divorce. And these are known in his research as the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse.
Yes, every therapist loves these.
Yes.
If you ever do couples counseling, you'll probably hear about
these. Hear about the 4 horsemen, which are criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling.
I mean, just listening to those, I'm thinking, wow, those sound like most lawyers, no?
I know. And I found it interesting when we were reading more about the Gottmans after this talk, and that contempt is the worst of all of them. They actually say that that is the one that can be most destructive because it means that you truly disrespect another person. And contempt has a profound effect on a couple because couples are contemptuous of each other, are even more likely to suffer from infectious illnesses than couples who are not contemptuous of each other. So I guess if you're in a relationship, be nice to each other so you don't get sick.
No, it's true. I've read that you're better off being single than being in an unhappy relationship. I mean, the best idea is that you have a happy relationship, but if you don't have a happy relationship, you're physically better off being by yourself.
Yeah, which is crazy. But anyway, this is not a self-help relationship podcast. So one of the things we wanted to talk about is what can the lessons from the Gottmans' work have to do with law school and lawyers? And we think that the lessons that they have learned about romantic couples can be applied to other important relationships, especially those in the workplace. So the first thing I thought about when we were talking about doing a podcast on this was in their talk, they actually talked about how relationships are something that we actually need. We need this personal connection with other people. And I think sometimes we forget that.
No, I think that's right. I mean, particularly, sometimes people think like, oh, I'm going to spend all my time at work, but I'm not really going to have a relationship with these people. But I think that's completely wrong. I mean, these are actually the people who you spend most of your time with.
Yeah.
So ideally, you should kind of like them,
right?
And feel comfortable with them and feel like you might want to be in relationship with them, which understandably, in some cases, in working in the legal profession might not actually be true.
Yeah. And, these relationships, even in the workplace or any significant relationship or friendship that you have, they give us connections with other people, and those connections allow us to grow. Because when you're in a trusted relationship, you open yourself up to influence, and you can learn and grow from that influence. And I think, maybe you don't want to open yourself up to every single person you meet in your workplace, but it's likely if you are investing in a firm and you have bonded with some of your coworkers, and maybe you have mentors and friends that you kind of really rely on and talk about important things with, that these can be relationships that are very important to you.
Yeah, I think ideally, at a minimum, you've got mentors, hopefully sponsors, people that you can learn from as a young attorney. If you don't have that in a workplace, I think you kind of question whether you should really be there, because that's kind of the point. It's like, at an early stage of your career, you need to be learning from the people around you, and they need to be taking an interest in you, and vice versa.
And if you're working a lot, then you are typically working and playing with those people too.
Right. You're spending most of your life with them.
Yeah. So. Or if you travel, I know you traveled a lot for your litigation.
Oh yeah, we traveled. Teams. Sometimes it was great. Sometimes it was terrible. The boss that I liked the best occasionally would, if we were having a really rough deposition or something, I remember once at least she hired massage people to come to our hotel rooms and give us a massage. And that was fantastic.
Yeah. So we have done a lot of reading and talked to a lot of people. Don't you think lawyers are generally terrible at relationships?
Well, certainly they're regarded as being terrible partners in a lot of ways. I think we actually have a whole series, on the Law School Toolbox Career Dicta site about this from a lawyer therapist. There are a number of lawyer therapists. All of them seem to think that lawyers have fairly consistent relationship problems that go back to fairly consistent things that I think you can really put into this Four Horsemen kind of framework, whether it's in the workplace, like why is the legal workplace so crazy, and why is so much bad behavior tolerated, or people in personal relationships. A friend of mine in law school once had an idea that he wanted to rank like a law firm misery index, and he was going to find out the average number of divorces per partner.
Ooh.
And we're all like, wow, that's a pretty good idea. He's like, because it's probably over one, but are we talking like 2, 3? Right. You could probably find some useful information out here.
That's very true. I think that's really interesting. Yeah, I think that, there's something about how the law teaches us to think and cope with difficult things. I know we were having lunch yesterday talking about this, how when you're in law school and when you're practicing law, you oftentimes are dealing with emotionally challenging things.
Right.
And law school doesn't really teach us how to cope with them. They kind of tell us that we're not supposed to be bothered by them.
Right, that we're just supposed to focus on the logic and ignore emotion. But the reality is, most legal context, emotion is kind of driving the show.
Right.
Even if you're going to be, say, an M&A lawyer, you might think, oh, well, this is all just business. But it's never just business. It's all about managing the people and the emotions and what people want and understanding what they want. Any negotiation is basically understanding what the other party wants, understanding what you can give them, what you can't give them, and then dealing with a lot of the emotional fallout from that of, basically saying like, well, we can't give you what you want, but we still want to do this deal. These are difficult conversations, and I think most people have very little, if any, training in how to deal with this. Yeah.
And we've been reading some other work by a psychiatrist named Dan Siegel that we'll talk about more in a future podcast. We also saw him at Wisdom 2.0. But one of the things that I've really appreciated from his work that's kind of in the same space is he talks about a lot about the left brain and the right brain and how we can really just end up only thinking in our logical brain and not our emotional brain, our right brain. And I feel like when I look at these four horsemen of like the criticism, contempt, divisiveness, and stonewalling, this idea that this is the way that many lawyers are trained to deal with conflict is like introducing these elements into their relationships, that is easier for lawyers because we are taught to be very left-brained.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes people think that's what clients are looking for in certain contexts. The classic kind of divorce lawyer is, I want somebody who's going to be a real bulldog on my behalf. And it was interesting because I'm on a mailing list of people, and someone actually said that, and various other people who'd had the experience of going through different types of divorces kind of wrote in and said, you really need to think about whether this is what you want. And I think lawyers think that's what people want, but I'm not sure that's what really serves them necessarily.
I think that's true, because you have to look at a bigger picture. Like, litigation isn't all it's cracked up to be.
No, I mean, I had a theory, even in commercial litigation cases, that literally only crazy people went to trial, because why would you?
Yeah.
You know, there's basically, there are very few reasons in commercial cases to actually go to trial.
Yeah.
So there had to be really like people stuff going on in order for this trial to be happening. It very rarely had much of anything to do with the underlying issues or the money involved. It was just like both sides are basically being controlled by crazy people, and that is why we were at this trial.
Yeah. I think that, the nature of the profession is that we typically sit in conflict. Very few people call a lawyer because everything's going great.
Right, exactly. Yeah, you don't get called in because everything's going well.
Right. And so since pretty much most of our interactions are going to be based around conflict, I think this idea of the techniques that we can use communicating with each other and being better communicators within conflict is what makes this kind of idea of looking at interpersonal relationships that may be romantic or personal, and the lessons we can learn to apply those to different relationships. And there are people who are working on this idea. I think especially in the mindfulness community, in the legal profession, people are talking about, hey, if we are like kinder people, if we are less combative, if we come with an open heart, if we can be a little bit compassionate, that we can change the legal profession and maybe reduce our confrontations so they are less hostile and being more thoughtful. I took a mindfulness and lawyering course with Judy Cohen, who runs a company called Warrior One. And one of the things she said, which I thought was very interesting, as a lawyer who is a few generations in front of us, she was saying how technology has made being a mindful lawyer so much more difficult. She's like, because pre-email, if you got a nasty letter or something from, opposing counsel, you would get the letter. It would have been on your inbox. You take out the letter, you read it, you get really angry. Maybe you dictate a response, or maybe you draft a quick response, and then you hand it to your assistant or your secretary, and maybe they type it up and put it on letterhead, or then they give it back to you to proof, and then you sign it, and then you put it in the envelope, and then you have it mailed. Like, there are a lot of steps in that communication.
Right. Places to think, is this really the letter I want to send?
Exactly.
Is this actually going to help the situation?
Right. So, maybe that initial draft, you get it back from your secretary, and you're like, maybe I went a little...
Yeah, maybe we could take out some of this language.
Maybe there's some contempt in there. Maybe I don't need that contempt in there.
Maybe we're stonewalling them.
Right, exactly. Or, you were more likely to get a voicemail when you would call somebody's office because people didn't have cell phones. And so oftentimes...
or you would get literally their secretary who's going to be polite to you, even if the person that they're being polite on behalf of doesn't really like you very much.
Exactly. So I think it's interesting that technology has really made it harder for us to self-regulate around this kind of communication. And I think it has created an opportunity maybe for us to, fall into these traps, so that our work relationships are more like having an argument with a significant other, where you're sitting down and you're just like, you're not even thinking. You're just responding back to each other.
Right, or you're just like texting or WhatsApping. And you're basically like, now that you can respond from your phone, basically lawyers are responding like that. And,
right.
I think we probably all have stories of either things we've done or things we've seen where it was not necessarily... what should have happened, whether it's just a reply all that shouldn't have gone. I mean, I have a situation when I was working where the partner accidentally replied all to a judge saying how stupid she was.
Oops.
Oopsies. Yeah, didn't go well, that case. And that's one of those things where obviously that is not a letter that ever would have gone out. Someone would have caught this.
Right. Yeah. It's not like the CC would have gotten into an envelope.
And the secretary's like, do you want to send this?
Right.
Yeah.
So I think, as young lawyers, many of whom have never worked in an office environment without email and without texting, without cell phones, I think you want to think about, how you can be a bit more conscious of how you communicate, especially within conflict, and then how you communicate with your peers to maybe create, more trusting and vulnerable and honest relationships.
Yeah, and sometimes I think when people are listening to this, they hear things like vulnerable, and they're like, no, I don't want to be vulnerable as a lawyer. Like, that's the last thing that I want to be.
Right.
And I think there is some of this training around, like, you have to suppress any sort of emotional reaction to things. You have to be that logical person. You have to be a certain way. You have to not be vulnerable. But I think the reality is The most effective attorneys are often people who have the most emotional intelligence because that's what helps them understand other people. And yeah, maybe they go into court and they put on their bulldog face, but behind the scenes, you can hang out with them and have a drink and coffee and like they're fine people and they understand other people. So I think, it's this balance. Obviously, you can't go into like a very combative courtroom situation and be like, well, let's just all talk about our feelings. You've got your role. But I think behind that role, there's a lot more leeway than people sort of realize.
I think that's true. I was also reading Brene Brown's latest book, Dare to Lead. If you're listening to this and you're like, vulnerability, no.
I don't do that.
I don't do that.
She has a great one, a bunch of lawyer friends that have read on my suggestion and really found it life-changing, which I think was The Gifts of Imperfection. An earlier classic Brene work.
Really, you can just pick up a Brene book.
Any of them. They're all based. She says
listen to a TED Talk. It starts. She's got her own language. You got to rumble. You got to do all this stuff. But I think that there is a lot of power in the way she even talks about herself. And I think that we've seen her speak in person. We've listened to her TED Talks. We've read her books. And when she talks about vulnerability and then uses examples for herself about how she needs to come with vulnerability and openness, you see that it's not weakness.
Right, exactly, which I think people sometimes confuse.
Right. And that it's not admitting that you're incompetent or it's being self-deprecating. It's a very specific thing. So if that idea interests you, we can link to some of Brené's work, but it's worth kind of investigating this idea of what does it mean to be vulnerable in a non-negative way, I guess would be the way.
Yeah, because her point is sort of vulnerability leads to courage, and courage leads, to you being able to take the action that you need to take, which is kind of the opposite of what happens with a lot of attorneys, where they kind of get paralyzed in these negative states of depression and anxiety, and they're actually not able to take the actions that they need or want to take. So yeah, it kind of flips that on its head, and you sort of realize like, oh, the reason that you're in that state is that you're unwilling or unable to be vulnerable.
Right. And in Dare to Lead, which I kind of like, and I think is an interesting book for anyone, even lawyers who think they might work with a team, which I think this is another area where our legal education fails us, is that lawyers are typically managers.
Almost always working in a team, either as the manager or the managee.
And typically have not had a lot of education around how to work with teams.
True.
That she talks about vulnerability in the context of how to, create important interpersonal dynamics within a team and move your team forward, and also make a culture so that your team can come to you with difficult conversations, even criticisms about you, and you being able to openly listen to them.
Yeah, which I think is another thing that's really overlooked in a lot of legal contexts, because the idea that you would go to someone and tell them, I think we're making a mistake here, which I did on numerous occasions because I'm an opinionated person who figured that they're actually paying me for my opinion. But it was really shocking to people, not in a bad way. But, I remember once I had our local counsel sent me a private email. I was like, wow, I'm really impressed that you sent that email saying like, that you think we shouldn't do this to the whole team. And I'm like, well, that's what I'm paid for.
Right. I'm paid to think.
He's like, yeah, but most people wouldn't have sent that. And, in the end, like that's actually valuable feedback. I mean, maybe people don't love it at the time.
Right.
But it kind of is your job to be the one who's like, you know what, like I'm closer to this situation and I think we're about to make a big mistake here.
Right. And if you are thoughtful about your communication style, you have a higher likelihood of that being received in a good way.
Right. I mean, you can't just be like, no, we're not doing this.
Yeah, you can't be like a petulant child.
Right. But, I think learning how to frame these difficult insights or conversations or whatever it is actually just going to make you probably more successful as an attorney and also more successful as a human being.
One of the stories that Brene Brown tells in Dare to Lead is one of the terms that she uses is when you need to have a difficult conversation, she calls it a rumble. And so she was talking about her team that works for her, and that a couple of the leaders on her team came to her and were basically like, we need to rumble with you, which I actually thought is kind of brilliant because, in a way, going back to what the Gottmans were saying, it's always dangerous when somebody says we need to talk.
Right.
But it's a way of saying, like, we need to talk, like, get ready because something's coming.
This is going to be a hard conversation.
Right, exactly. And then, she's like, okay. And what they were presenting her is that she is really bad at setting deadlines and timelines for projects. And so she's always over optimistic. And then she sets these really aggressive goals, and her team can never meet the goals. And then everybody's falling behind, and everybody's working too much, and everybody's stressed and unhappy. And they're like, we need to work on goal setting. You're not very good at estimating how long projects will take. And so it was interesting for her in the book to talk about how that made her feel, and then also how she kind of had to be open to that difficult conversation, and instead of getting, like, going back to the Four Horsemen, defensive or shutting down, like having an actual dialogue. And they were pretty much somebody else should work on timelines.
Right, which completely makes sense. That's probably just not her skill set.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember early on at one point you took the checkbook away from me.
I did take the checkbook away from me.
I had not paid some bills. And you're like, you know what? You have a lot of great qualities. Paying bills on time is not one of them. So I'm going to take this over. Yes. And I was just like, oh, that is such a relief.
I know.
Because I know I'm bad at that.
Yeah. But you're good at a lot of things I'm not that good at. I mean, that's the beauty of a partnership, any sort of partnership. And I think, people think that work partnerships, you can't acknowledge stuff like that.
Yeah.
That you're like, this shouldn't be my responsibility. Somebody else should be better at this. You don't want to go into a job situation to your supervisor and basically be like, I'm bad at this. But if you're,
well, I mean, you kind of can be.
You can be. Or if you're on a team, you can be thoughtful about who should take certain responsibilities.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely had conversations with some of my bosses where I'm like, you know what? I don't think that we're using my skill set in a way that makes the most sense and the most value, because what you have me doing, I'm not good at. I don't want to be doing. I'm angry about doing it. Yeah, I understand it needs to be done, but maybe I'm not the most appropriate person to do this. Like, I have higher value skills I can offer you. And, after a moment of kind of, oh, wait, what? You're telling me you're not going to do doc review? There was this moment of like, actually, you know what? You're completely right about that. I was like, I could either be writing this brief or I could be doing doc review. Which of these is more replaceable? And I think that is a conversation you have to approach carefully, but you definitely can have that type of conversation and advocate for yourself.
So I think if you're listening to this conversation and you're thinking, wow, maybe I am combative or, defensive or stonewall, which is basically just shut down during difficult conversations, then, maybe you want to go to therapy, or maybe you want to start educating yourself on these different communication styles, because I have learned a lot in my many years in the world. It seems like many more. But by just reading and learning from these different perspectives of how different people think we build positive relationships, by how our brains work. We had this very interesting lunch yesterday where we talked about all this stuff, but, we were just talking about how in our own lives we have learned more about how we react to situations, how our childhood has led to us to react to certain situations, how we can change how we react to certain situations. And I think there's this idea that you're kind of stuck where you are. If you're somebody who gets very defensive and that's how you deal with conflict, that's how you are, and that's not true.
No, I mean, speaking from personal experience, I know you definitely, these are skills that you can learn. I mean, for me, I used to be one of those people who just was very conflict adverse. I mean, ironic, I became a lawyer. I think that actually weirdly happens to a lot of litigators I know. It's like, no one ever asked you, do you like conflict? And, so I was one of those people who just would never say anything until it suddenly blew up. And then, of course, you're having this massively outscaled reaction to something that's really not a big deal that no one's understanding. And so, you really have to, kind of train yourself to speak up earlier. But that's doable. You can do that. You can learn to do that.
And I thought that was one of the interesting points that the Gottmans made, was they talk about conflict as a regrettable event, which I thought was pretty amazing.
That's a good way of phrasing it.
And, they were saying regrettable events will happen. You are never going to eliminate conflict. The only thing that you really can change is how that it's resolved. And it's that resolution that's the most important.
Well, and another interesting point they made was that some enormous percentage of conflict, at least in relationships, romantic relationships, is actually never resolved.
67%.
Yeah, 67% is what do they call it, a perpetual conflict. So, and it may also be that you encounter these type of things in the work situation too, where someone has to do document review. That's just the way it is.
Right.
But the way that you talk about and think about these things, you can live with the conflict as long as it's kind of handled properly.
And that if some damage is done in the conflict, you can still repair.
Right.
And they were even talking about the importance of, if you have children, modeling how you repair a conflict in front of them. Because if you don't show children how conflict is repaired, their cortisol levels don't go down. They remain stressed seeing the conflict. So it's like even children need that resolution. And so I think even in a workplace, if there's been conflict, you've gotten into an argument with the boss, you've made a huge mistake, things aren't going well, whatever it might be, you can come to the resolution with a different perspective than I think just the conflict.
Yeah, and I think sometimes what's difficult in legal situations in a workplace is that the people above you kind of get away with some pretty terrible behavior and never actually make amends for it. And I think that is one of those things that can be really draining for people and can really cause people to leave. So, if you are in a managerial position, you need to think about how you are managing conflict with your team. And if you're throwing erasers at people and never apologizing, they're probably not going to keep working for you.
That's true. Yeah. So let's talk about some of the things that we have learned both through these talks and stuff that we've been reading. If you're connected to an individual, it's important to think about how you talk to that person. And so when conflict arises, what should some of the things that people should start thinking about doing to start resolving the conflict in a more positive way?
Well, and I think a lot of these apply to just for any difficult situation. So, as we mentioned earlier, a lot of the times when you're an attorney, maybe it could be your pro bono work, or it could be if you're doing public interest work, or just generally doing your work. You're probably going to encounter people who are talking about things that are difficult for them. Mm-hmm. So I think the number one thing is just really just try to be present and to be a really good listener, which is difficult for attorneys because they're always thinking about what they want to say in response or what argument they want to make. But really, I think, for a lot of these things, the most important thing is just to feel like somebody's actually listening to you.
Yeah. When I took that Essential Mindfulness for Lawyers course, one of the exercises we did was we had to just listen to someone talk for 2 or 3 minutes without responding.
Yeah, I've done that exercise. It's really interesting.
It's really hard.
Yeah. No, I did it was like a meditation group or something at this workspace we're in. And it was not very long, a minute or two. And the person was just supposed to tell you about something about their day. And it's very difficult to just sit there and not ask them questions and not respond and just say, oh, okay, yeah. It's really hard. Or isn't it called reflective listening, where you repeat back what you've heard after somebody? Lee, what I hear you saying is...
That's also a hard exercise if you've never done it.
And that's a really important one, actually, for lawyers, because you actually do need to make sure that you've heard what you think you've heard. Say you're doing an intake interview or even in a deposition or something like that. You want to actually be clear on what the other person is saying to you.
Yeah. It's so true. So these, again, are skills that can be practiced.
Oh, for sure.
And learning how to be present, learning how to listen carefully, and even one of the other things that we've been talking about in this other research we've been reading by this guy, Dan Siegel, he even talks about using your other senses to really try and, you're not just listening with your eyes or your ears. Well, of course, you're not listening with your eyes, but you're listening with your ears, but you're observing somebody's mannerisms, facial expressions. You're trying to sense their energy. You're trying to kind of really take in with your whole body what the experience is. And I think with clients, especially if you're trying to decide, is somebody telling the truth?
Right.
Are they leaving things out? I think that by practicing using a lot of these senses, you can learn a lot more, but you have to be aware of yourself before you can be aware of other people.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. And, a lot of this just takes time, too. If you have an important conversation, you probably don't want to schedule it, at the very end of the day for 15 minutes. You know? Have that conversation when people are fresh and, make sure you have enough time for it. Mm-hmm. So, lawyers are very time-oriented. But I think, too, making clear to people, even if it is just 5 or 10 minutes, but, hey, there's something important I need to talk to you about. Do you have 5 or 10 minutes?
Yeah.
At least framing it for them so they know, okay, this is not just somebody coming to chat.
Right. Also, I have seen some research where walking with somebody and doing walking difficult conversations can be very productive if you have that opportunity, because moving your body can help you kind of manage your emotions a little bit better, and you don't have to look at a person.
Right, you're side by side. You're kind of on the same team.
Yeah,
versus glaring at each other across the desk.
Yeah, from where somebody's from a position of power behind the big desk and you're in a different situation.
Yeah, so I think a lot of like just even thinking about, I mean, somebody might be listening to this like, oh, that wouldn't make any difference. But if you think about like these power dynamics and things like that, you start to understand like if you control the room. I mean, I read an interesting email the other day from a venture capitalist who was talking about how to set up a networking dinner. And it was his advice was so specific. You know, it was like, you need to sit here and like, this is the way you organize the chairs. And these things really make a difference. So if you're not paying attention to them, like you're kind of missing out on opportunities.
Yeah. One of the other things that the Gottmans talked about, which I think is a good rule of thumb that oftentimes we all ignore, this has probably been pointed out to most of us, is how you talk about needs. And I liked this idea of if you need something, you want to present it as a positive need. I need help with this.
Right.
I need you to do this for me, instead of a negative need, which is I wish you would stop doing this. And I think as a manager, that's something I try and be conscious of, because if you're trying to set someone up for success, I also learned how to do this with my children, but you want to tell them of the behavior that you want to be a repeatable behavior. But if you don't tell them what you want, then people are just guessing. So if you're telling somebody, I want you to stop doing this, then they're like, well, what should I do instead?
Right. Like there's an infinite universe of other things I could do. Would you prefer any one of those
things?
It's
like, do you just want trial and error till I get it right? Like, I don't know that that's true. So, you know, little things like this and like how you frame your language can really change the outcome of a conflict discussion.
Right. And then I think this is a situation where if you're the underling in that scenario, you can use reflective listening back to your boss and say, well, what I hear you saying you need from me is X, Y, and Z. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
And they might not have even directly said that, but at least then they're thinking, oh, what do I need? Yeah, okay, no, I need you to do this other thing instead.
Yeah. So, you know, if some of this stuff and some of these exercises are interesting to you, you can definitely learn more about them on the internet or in books. But it could be an interesting exercise for study groups to do together if you want to work on these interpersonal skills. If you have a group of friends at school and you want to do reflective listening exercises, or you want to do these listening meditations that we've been talking about, or you want to, you know, practice, you know, how to change up language, I don't think you have to necessarily go to therapy.
It is helpful, though. I use a lot of therapy techniques with bosses, for sure.
Oh, yeah. I mean, therapy is great. And if you have access to that, you know, we're big fans of that. But I think that there are lots of things, even with your peers, that you can practice.
Yeah, just how you would phrase certain things, or even after the fact, you know, not necessarily mulling things over forever, but hey, you know, I had this conversation, it didn't go well. Like, can you think of a different way I could have done this? Becoming sort of cognizant of that, I think, can be helpful going forward.
Yeah. And, you know, again, circling back to the Gottmans' work, this idea of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, the things that we do that are incredibly damaging to each other, you just probably want to practice staying away from. And sometimes, you know,
definitely catch yourself.
Doing them. And if you get angry and are caught on a bad day and you're tired or you've been working a lot, I think it's really easy to, you know, fall into these negative habits. We've all done it. I don't think anyone has not had a regrettable incident.
But you have to repair. And so, you know, try and avoid these things. But if nothing else, try and at least be on the lookout for them so you can repair if they start happening. And I think as quickly as possible, too. You know, if you find yourself saying something like the sooner the better, just take a deep breath, take a step back and say, you know what? I realized that did not come out very nicely. Like, I apologize for that. You know, let's move on. Right.
And I think especially in the world of email, you've got to be a little more careful about stuff like this because things can be misconstrued.
And they're there forever.
Yeah.
So be careful what you write.
Yeah. Maybe it's better to take that walking lunch discussion.
After you've done doc review, you never look at email the same way again.
So true.
All right. Well, unfortunately with that, we are out of time. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app because we'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Allison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.